In 1620, a single ship, a cargo vessel, barely longer than 2 city buses, became a floating world of hardship, bravery, and staggering loss. It carried 102 souls across a violent ocean, and in doing so, laid the foundation for a new nation. The story of the Mayflower is a story of survival against all odds. It's a testament to human endurance carved into the frozen shores of a new world. But amid the sickness, the storms, and the constant presence of death, another story was unfolding. A quiet, improbable romance between a humble ship's cooper and a young woman who had lost everything. This is the story of their love, born from the harshest realities of the Mayflower voyage. And it's also the story of how 400 years later, that love became a map for millions seeking to find their own place in the American story. And be sure to watch this video until the end, because we will also be discussing how we, as genealogists and family historians, go about researching this power couple from 400 years ago and transform them from legend to fact. Today, on Trace Your New England Roots. Happy Thanksgiving, my friends, and welcome back. To really get the miracle of John Alden and Priscilla Mullins, you first have to understand the world that forged them. Now, let's be clear. The Mayflower, it wasn't a cruise ship. It was a cargo ship that was built for hauling wine and cloth, not people. And for the 102 passengers crammed below deck, the journey was 66 days of near constant misery. Let's picture it. The lower decks, where families huddled together, had ceilings so low many adults couldn't stand up straight. There were no windows and there was no fresh air. The space was a cold, damp, and perpetually dark cavern filled with a stench of unwashed bodies, seasickness, and spoiled food. Water constantly dripped through the leaky upper boards of the ship. This meant that nobody was ever truly dry. They survived on a diet of hardtack, which is kind of like a hard biscuit that was hard enough to break a tooth, salted beef, and beer, since fresh water was impossible to keep sanitary for that long. It was a perfect breeding ground for scurvy and other diseases. On board, a fragile social order was tested every single day. The passengers were split into 2 main groups. There were the saints, and then there were the strangers. The saints, whom we now call the Pilgrims, were religious separatists who were on the run from persecution in England. They were a tight-knit community bound by a shared divine purpose. And the strangers, on the other hand, were a mixed bag of merchants, soldiers, and skilled workers who were recruited by the investors back in London. They weren't there for religious freedom. They were there for a job. And among these strangers was a young man named John Alden, who was born around 1598. He was no pilgrim. He was just a cooper, a barrel maker, who was hired in Southampton right before the ship set sail. His job was critical. In the 17th century, barrels were the lifeblood of society. They were the equivalent of today's shipping containers. They held everything from water and beer to even gunpowder and flour. A cooper was a master craftsman whose skill was just as essential for survival as a farmer or a soldier. Governor William Bradford later called Alden a hopeful young man who was free to go back to England on the Mayflower. But in the end, John chose to stay. Also on board was a young woman named Priscilla Mullins, traveling with her father William, who was a successful shoemaker, her mother Alice, and her brother Joseph. She was around 17, and she was part of a family who was protected and provided for. The voyage itself was a terrifying ordeal. After a bunch of costly delays, they finally set out alone in September. It was way too late in the year. And in the middle of the Atlantic, they were hammered by ferocious storms. The winds were so bad that the crew had to drop the sails and just drift, totally at the mercy of the waves. And at one point, a massive wave cracked one of the ship's main support beams, which sparked panic below deck. The ship just might have been lost if the passengers hadn't brought what they called a great iron screw, which probably was a house jack, which they used to painstakingly lift the beam back into place. After more than 2 brutal months at sea, they finally sighted land on November 9th, 1620. But they were dangerously off course, far north of their real destination near the Hudson River. With winter closing in and supplies running low, they dropped anchor in what is now Provincetown Harbor on November 11th and made a fateful decision. They decided that they were going to stay. But their ordeal, it wasn't over. It was actually just getting started. And that first winter in Plymouth, for lack of a better term, was a catastrophe. The settlers were simply not ready for the brutal New England weather. They were weak, starving, and riddled with disease. They tried to build shelters, but the ground was frozen solid, and the work was slow and agonizing. For months, most of the colonists stayed on the cold, damp Mayflower, only rowing ashore during the day to work and then headed back to the ship at night. Sickness, which Bradford described as a general sickness of coughs and fevers, tore through the small community with horrifying speed. At its worst, only about 7 people were actually healthy enough to care for the dozens who were sick and dying. The death toll was staggering, and by the spring of 1621, nearly half of the 102 passengers were dead. Of the 18 married women who had made the journey, 13 had just died. Entire families were wiped out. For Priscilla Mullins, that winter was an unspeakable tragedy. She watched her father, her mother, and her brother all die from this sickness. And by spring, By spring, she was now an orphan, completely alone in a desolate, alien world, surrounded by death and grief. It's almost impossible to imagine her state of mind. The crushing loss, the fear, you could just imagine the utter isolation. And yet, it was right there in that landscape of absolute despair that the first seeds of a new beginning and a new love were sown. Well, out of the ashes of that horrible first winter, a new community, a community began to take shape, held together by this shared trauma and the fierce will to survive. And in that fragile community, one of the first and most enduring legends of American folklore began to form. This was the love story of John Alden and Priscilla Mullins. This story has been passed down for centuries. It's a classic love triangle made famous in 1858 by the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who, by the way, was a direct descendant of John and Priscilla himself. His epic poem, The Courtship of Miles Standish, became an absolute sensation, reportedly selling 10,000 copies in London in a single day. And it cemented this romance in the American mind. According to Longfellow's version, the colony's military captain, who was named Miles Standish, he was a brave, albeit gruff, and older soldier, whose own wife, Rose, had also died that winter, decided he wanted to marry Priscilla. But Standish, a man of action, he was apparently shy when it came to women and romance. So he turned to his much younger, fair-haired friend, John Alden, and asked him to propose to Priscilla on his behalf. Well, now, John was now in an impossible spot. He had also feelings for Priscilla too, but bound by loyalty and duty to his captain, he went to Priscilla's home. He did his duty, presenting Standish's case. He praised the captain's courage, and Priscilla listened patiently. But when John finally finished, she looked at him and said this now famous line, "Why don't you speak for yourself, John?" Now, do historians think this conversation literally happened? Well, it's debatable. The story was passed down as an oral tradition in the Alden family for generations before Longfellow wrote it down. And he definitely took some poetic license in writing the poem. There is no letter or diary from the 1620s that proves that this specific exchange took place. And whether the words were spoken exactly like that or not, the story captures an emotional truth that still hits home today. Priscilla, having survived unimaginable loss, she was not some passive character who was waiting to be chosen. She was a survivor who knew her own mind. And John, this simple, humble cooper, was the man she wanted. And sometime around 1622 or 1623, John Alden and Priscilla Mullins were married. They were one of the very first weddings, in the Plymouth Colony. Their marriage was more than just a wedding. It was a profound act of hope. And in a place where death had been the only constant. Their decision to build a life together was a defiant step toward the future. They were choosing life. They were choosing to create a family against overwhelming odds. And they went on to have 10 children and helped found the nearby town of Duxbury, Massachusetts. Now, John became one of the colony's most respected leaders. He served for many years as an assistant to the governor and as the colony's treasurer. John was the last surviving male signer of the Mayflower Compact. He lived all the way until 1687. Their story became a foundational myth, not just for a family, but for a nation. It spoke of courage, resilience, and the triumph of love and personal choice over duty and social rank. But what happened to their improbable family? Well, their story didn't end in Plymouth. It, in fact, branched out across centuries, spawning a legacy that is almost impossibly vast. Today, an estimated 35 million people worldwide can trace their ancestry back to the passengers of the Mayflower. And a huge number of them descend directly from this one couple, this barrel maker and the orphan girl who found each other in a new world. Their descendants include U.S. Presidents John Adams and John Quincy Adams. We've mentioned the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and even modern figures like Marilyn Monroe, Clint Eastwood, and even Orson Welles. This brings up a fascinating question. How? How do we possibly bridge a 400-year gap to connect someone living today to that legendary couple? How does a family story go from a whispered legend to a documented fact? And this brings us to the modern quest. For millions of people, the question, could I be a Mayflower descendant? It's the part of a fantastic historical puzzle. It's a journey that turns history from a dusty textbook into a deeply personal story. So let's follow the path of a modern genealogist. We'll call her Eleanor. And as she tries to solve this very puzzle, for Eleanor, the quest doesn't start with some ancient manuscript, but with a simple family story. Her grandmother always used to say that their family was one of old New England stock, and that they had an ancestor who came over on the Mayflower. This is a common family legend, the kind most people hear, but few ever really look into. But for Eleanor, it's a spark. So where does she start? Well, with the golden rule of genealogy, you work backward from what you know. She interviews her oldest living relatives, gathering names, dates, and places, and she digs through old family Bibles, letters, and photo albums, hunting for clues. The goal is to build a direct, provable line from herself to her parents, to her grandparents, and so on and so on and so on. And next, she dives into the vast digital archives online. Websites like Ancestry and FamilySearch have become game changers, holding billions of digitized records. Eleanor starts searching, looking for primary source documents for each generation. These are the golden tickets. These are birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death certificates. She also hunts for census records, which, starting in 1790 in the United States, give you a snapshot of a family at a specific moment in time. For the first few generations, back to the late 1800s, the records are pretty easy to find. She successfully documents her great-grandparents and then her great-great-grandparents, finding their census records in Ohio, their marriage license in Pennsylvania, and their birth records in upstate New York. With each document, she's forging another link in the chain that's moving steadily back through time. But as she pushes into the early 1800s and late 1700s, she hits this infamous brick wall. This is the point where every genealogist wants to just pull their hair out. Records get scarce, names are spelled a dozen different ways, and crucially, it becomes incredibly hard to prove a female ancestor's parentage. Well, since their maiden names often vanish from official records. Eleanor then finds, she eventually finds a potential ancestor, a man named Samuel Copeland, in a 1790 Massachusetts census. But she can't find a birth record or a will that definitively connects him to the previous generation. And once again, her chain is broken. This is where the quest moves from simple database searches to more specialized resources. Frustrated but not defeated, Eleanor turns to the secret weapon of Mayflower genealogy. These are called the Silver Books. These are published by the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, the Mayflower families through five generations. As I've said, these are called the Silver Books for the definitive covers, and they are the absolute gold standard for this research. These meticulously researched volumes trace the lineages of Mayflower passengers for the first 5 generations, all based on primary sources like wills, land records, and church documents. Now, Eleanor gets the volume for John Alden. She starts not with John himself, but further down with the 5th generation, looking for a surname that matches a family in her own tree. She scours the pages, cross-referencing names and locations with her clues, and then she's got it, her eureka moment. In the Alden Silver Book, she finds a man named Elijah Copeland, whose wife is listed and whose children's birth dates perfectly match a family Bible record she found in her grandmother's attic. And most importantly, this Silver Book provides a citation for its information, a specific probate record, a will from Bridgewater, Massachusetts. Eleanor feels a surge of adrenaline. This is the lead she's been waiting for. She gets online and navigates to an archive of Massachusetts probate records. She finds the will for Elijah's father, and in that document, written in the elegant script of the 18th century, he names his son Elijah as his heir. The chain is repaired. Using the silver books as her guide, she can now confidently trace her line back generation by generation from her ancestor to their parents, all the way back to the first generation. She discovers she descends from John and Priscilla's daughter, Ruth Alden. Her grandmother's story, it wasn't just a legend. It was actually true. The connection has been made. 400 years of history suddenly collapse into a single unbroken line. It's a profound, deeply moving moment of discovery. The moment history stops being about them and starts being about us. Eleanor's journey from a whispered family story to a documented lineage is a path that anyone can follow. You can follow it. Uncovering your family story is one of the most rewarding puzzles you ever solve. It's about more than just names and dates. It's about discovering the challenges, triumphs, and everyday lives of the people who made you. It's about building your own family narrative. So, how do you start? The secrets to building your story are universal, whether you think you're related to the Mayflower or just want to know more about your great-grandparents. First, start with what you know. Just like Eleanor, talk to your family. Interview your parents, your grandparents, aunts and uncles. Ask about the stories they heard while they were growing up. What's your family's founding story? The one, the one that gets told at every reunion or at the Thanksgiving dinner table. Write everything down, even the tiny details. These oral histories, they're precious, and they're often the key that unlocks the whole thing. Second, get organized. Sketch out a simple family tree on paper or with genealogy software. Start with yourself and then work backwards, filling in what you know for sure. This helps you to create a visual map of your ancestry, and it helps you spot the actual gaps you need to fill. Third, become a detective and work backward one generation at a time. Use the big online databases to find those key primary sources: birth, marriage, and death records, plus census data. But a word of warning here: don't just blindly copy other people's family trees you find online. You can use them as clues, but always track down the original document to prove the information for yourself. Fourth, when you get further back and the trail goes cold, which it often does, turn to the experts. If you suspect a Mayflower line, the silver books are a must-have. But almost every region and ethnic group has its own dedicated historical societies, genealogical journals, and other specialized resources. Look for local historical societies in the areas where your ancestors actually lived. They often have records that you can't find anywhere else and have not been digitized online. Finally, consider DNA, but understand its limits. A DNA test can connect you with thousands of genetic cousins and confirm relationships, but it's not a replacement for the paper trail. A DNA match might show you're related to a known descendant of John Alden, which in itself is a powerful clue, but to join a group like the Mayflower Society, you still need to prove every single generational link with documentation. This process of discovery is a journey that connects us to something bigger than ourselves. Every family has a story. What's your family's founding legend? The one that gets told at every reunion, every Christmas, every Hanukkah, every Thanksgiving. Share it in the comments below. I'd love to hear the tales that have been passed down through your family. The story of John Alden and Priscilla Mullins lasts not just because it's a sweet romance. It lasts because it embodies a powerful truth that even in the darkest of times, hope always finds a way. Their marriage was an act of faith in the future, a single candle lit against the overwhelming darkness of that first Plymouth winter. Their legacy isn't just in the millions of descendants who carry their DNA. It's in the very idea that our lives are part of a much longer story. And that's the choices we make, the love we share, and the families we build that echo for centuries. Genealogy is so much more than a hobby. It's the act of reclaiming our own history. It teaches us that the past isn't some foreign country, that the people in the old photographs and faded documents aren't strangers. They're part of us. Their struggles were real, their triumphs were earned, and their story is our story. By seeking out their names and learning their histories, we do more than just fill out a family tree. We honor their memory, and in doing so, we discover our own place in the grand, unfolding narrative of the human family. We realize that history isn't just a collection of dates and facts, but a living, breathing story that we all take part of. If you found this journey into the past as fascinating as we did, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. And make sure to hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. There's also the new hype features. You can also find some links to some of the genealogical resources that I use when researching family histories. Thanks for watching. This is Eric with Trace Your New England Roots, where history starts with your family. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. God bless.